Every year in college football, there are teams that you feel just should have been better than they were by the end of the season. You look at teams like Kansas and USC this year, who should have at least been threats to their conference mates this season and dark horses to make their conference championship game, but so far they just have not been able to put it together. KU is currently 3-6, have had the lead in the fourth quarter in pretty much every game they've played, and USC is similar at 4-5, with a lot of those losses coming in one-score games that really come down to 2 or 3 missed plays per contest. When you look at games on their own, it's pretty clear these two teams aren't necessarily bad, but they're definitely unlucky, and they definitely don't have that clutch gene. But a few years ago, there was a team even more unlucky and finished the year at 3-9 despite having a positive score differential at the end of the season, and that was Nebraska in 2021, the craziest, bad, best, most awful team ever made. In today's video, we're going to be looking back at that Nebraska team and showcasing how and why they were the best awful team in the history of college football. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about 2021 Nebraska. Let's first start with the coaches. Nebraska was in year 4 under former quarterback Scott Frost as head coach, and by year 4, Nebraska fans were already soured on him. He just couldn't find ways to win big games. He had been hired from UCF back in 2017 when he was their head coach for 2 years in both 16 and 17. The Knights went 6-7 in 16 with a bowl game loss to Arkansas State, and the next year UCF went insane with a 13-0 record and a win over Auburn in the Peach Bowl, and they claimed for themselves a national championship even though they didn't make the college football playoff. But even a claim of a national championship was pretty much laughed at by the rest of the Power 5, and that was much closer than Nebraska had been in nearly 20 years. Nebraska is one of college football's blue blood programs, and despite their lack of success recently, they really have not been all that close to making a national championship since their first couple of years in the Big Ten after leaving from the Big 12. The concept of being able to bring back a national championship to Lincoln is something that Nebraska had been chasing since Bo Pelini was fired from there. What made it even better is that Scott Frost had been a quarterback at Nebraska from 1995 to 1997, the last year Nebraska won a national title. In the eyes of a lot of Husker fans, he was now coming home. The governor of Nebraska even declared an official Scott Frost Day when he was hired by the Huskers. What followed was really bad. The Cornhuskers started 2018 with 6 straight losses, the worst start in program history, on their way to finishing at 4-8, including 3 losses by less than 1 touchdown. They started 4-2 in 2019 and were on their way to their first bowl in years, but only won 1 more game and finished the year and ended up at 5-7. We all know the 2020 season was weird top to bottom, so it would be easy to ignore the Cornhuskers record that year of 3-5, but even then there were some really bad late game performances that year. 2021 was really a make or break season for Nebraska in a lot of ways, and they totally broke. But how did the season actually go, and how did they end up losing so many games? Well, they started off week 1 against Illinois. This was a Big Ten West Division game right off the bat, so there was instantly a lot of stakes. Illinois was in their first season under head coach Brett Bielema, and they'd end up finishing the year at 5-7, so they weren't necessarily a great team. In week 0, in a game that I was personally at, Nebraska ended up losing that game 30-22. Even though Adrian Martinez threw for over 230 yards and ran for over 100 with 2 scores, at one point they were even down 21 points. But the next couple of weeks, Nebraska was at home. They played FCS level Fordham and then the Buffalo Bulls that had just lost Lance Leipold as their head coach. Nebraska won both of those games in blowout fashion, 52-7 and 28-3. This had some people thinking that Nebraska had all the pieces to compete at a high level, but just needed to put it all together. But Fordham ended up going 6-5 in the FCS, and Buffalo ended that season at 4-8, so it was a little bit of fool's gold that wasn't really set in stone until the next week when Nebraska would travel to number 3 Oklahoma. This was an old rivalry game from their time in the Big 8, and Nebraska actually played Oklahoma really close in Norman, but they needed a touchdown in the last couple of minutes to get within 2 scores, and they lost the game by 7 points, 23-16. The ground game was completely ineffective, and Adrian Martinez threw a pretty bad interception on an OU side of the field that could have helped them stay in the game. Nebraska then followed it up with a 23-20 loss to number 20 Michigan State. They managed to get it all the way back to 2020 at the end of regulation, but after another bad Adrian Martinez pick, the Spartans got a chance with a field goal, and they won. They then come back home the next week and absolutely beat the brakes off of Northwestern, winning 56-7. At this point, 2 of their losses were by close margins to ranked teams, so there was some thought that they still might be good. Against number 9 Michigan the next week, Nebraska led late in the fourth quarter again, but choked the game away with 3 minutes left and let Michigan kick 2 field goals to win 32-29. They would then lose to unranked Minnesota the following week, 30-23, and they got down really early in that game. At one point, they were down 21-9 due to some very poor situational defense, and Minnesota was able to build up a lead that Nebraska could not come back from. Then at home against Purdue, Adrian Martinez threw 4 interceptions, and Purdue won 28-23, another close loss. Number 5 Ohio State was then in the house for the next game, and this was probably the most painful loss of the season for Nebraska. While the Buckeyes were never really in danger of losing, the defense held Ohio State to just 26 points, which was the lowest they would score all season. Nebraska could not overcome a 17-3 deficit that they were put into, and a touchdown near the end of the third quarter only made it 23-17. But they were marching late into the fourth quarter and were at midfield with just a minute left in the game, only for Adrian Martinez to throw another interception, and Ohio State was able to take over. They then would follow that game up with a 35-28 loss, number 15 Wisconsin in Madison, where the defense let Braylon Allen run for over 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. Nebraska tied the game multiple times despite this, and were down by just a touchdown with a minute remaining in the game. They then marched to the Wisconsin 11-yard line and were about to score when tight end Travis Vokalek had a very undisciplined holding call that set them back to 1st and 20 from the 21. Scott Frost then called 4 straight really bad passing plays, none of which worked, and Wisconsin took over on downs and Nebraska lost. That left for the final game of the season with nothing left to fight for except pride. In a rivalry game against number 16 Iowa, Adrian Martinez had been benched for his backup, Logan Smothers, in hopes that Logan would finally develop. In this game, Spencer Petras, Iowa's quarterback, threw for just 100 yards and no touchdowns. Logan ended up throwing for less than 200 yards, but added an interception and 2 scores on the ground. Nebraska was able to survive Iowa's running back Tyler Goodson, and at the end of the third quarter, they were winning 21-9. At this point in the game, Nebraska had a 94% chance to win, according to ESPN. And guess what? They lost. The Nebraska defense completely collapsed at the start of the fourth quarter, allowing Iowa to score 19 points in the fourth quarter alone. But it wasn't just their fault. The offense stalled out immediately to start out the fourth and had a punt blocked for a touchdown. They followed it up with a fumble at midfield on their next drive, a safety, another punt, and then an interception. Nebraska would finish the 2021 season at a 3-9 record, and of those 9 losses, 8 were by 7 points or less, and 3 of them were by 5 points or less. As I've already talked about, lots of those games came down to really bad game management and turnovers at really bad times. Part of that was not on Nebraska's coaching staff of Scott Frost, offensive coordinator Matt Lubbock, or defensive coordinator Eric Chinnander, as some of them really weren't all that bad. Some of it is on the players at Nebraska, and one player gets a lot of the focus, quarterback Adrian Martinez. He was a 4-star recruit in the class of 2018 out of California, and was one of Coach Frost's big recruiting wins from his first year in Lincoln. Adrian would play 4 seasons at Nebraska, all coached by Frost, and in 2018 he threw for 2,600 yards with 17 touchdowns, and he had some trouble with turnovers at bad moments, but there was thought since he was just a true freshman, he would grow in time and develop, especially under a former quarterback at head coach. Instead, Adrian never developed during his time at Nebraska, and never really got any better. He kept getting injured while trying to do too much for the Huskers, and in his senior season in 2021, he threw for 2,900 yards with 14 touchdowns and 10 picks. You could make the argument that he got worse during his time at Nebraska, and you could definitely make the argument it wasn't even 100% his fault. What makes Adrian even more of an example of Coach Frost's inability to develop players is what happened after the 2021 season. He grad transferred to Kansas State and looked better than he ever did at Nebraska. K-State let him run more than he did at Nebraska, but the worst thing about it was Adrian wasn't even the best quarterback on the roster at the time, and he got beat out by Will Howard at the end of the year when K-State won the Big 12 championship. Nebraska's quarterback room during the Scott Frost era was so bad that they completely mismanaged their best player into being a quarterback that he just wasn't. After having some of that success at K-State, he ended up being a good player in the USFL and is currently with the Jets. Frost also mismanaged players like Samori Toure, Feldarius Payne, and Cam Taylor-Britt. He just couldn't develop these players, which you need to do to win at the Power 5 level, and he didn't have to do it at UCF, but absolutely had to at Nebraska. So that's where we come to our final question. Who's really to blame for Nebraska being so close yet so far in 2021? Well, you could blame it on the players or the schedule in the tough Big Ten Conference, since they did in fact play 6 ranked opponents, but there's really one quick way of determining fault. The old saying goes that good teams consistently figure out how to win hard games. In his tenure at head coach at Nebraska, Scott Frost was 5-20 in games decided by 8 points or less, and 0-14 against ranked opponents. He wasn't just choking away games, he was flat out not showing up to games against ranked competition. It was tough for Nebraska fans to accept that Coach Frost just wasn't working out, but after a couple bad games in 2022, they finally moved on from him, and so far, Matt Rhule, his replacement, is doing an alright job. It's probably going to take some time, but Nebraska should someday be a contender again. As long as they don't have another demoralizing season like 2021, they should be okay. In my opinion, that 2021 Nebraska team is the best worst college football team ever, and honestly really could have gone undefeated. They obviously had the talent and weren't getting blown out, but they could just never execute, and they just had some sort of curse or something. But what do you guys think? If you're a Nebraska fan, what the heck went wrong in 2021? Who's another unlucky player or team or season? And let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to leave a like if you didn't support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.